Good morning. Es posible para mí jugar? It's a question that I heard about 45 years ago that I've never forgotten. When I was 18 years old and a freshman in college, I went on my very first international mission trip. As a college freshman, we traveled to Belize in Central America and then to Panama. And in Panama, we were this group of college students. We did a variety of things, but we were playing on a Saturday afternoon. We were playing in the park, playing soccer with just whoever showed up. It's always fascinating to watch the response of kids, especially internationally, when they run across Americans. And so we were playing soccer, so everybody wanted to play soccer. It's probably the first soccer match, probably the last soccer match I ever had that had like 47 people on the field, And as I was running back and forth, I noticed on the sideline, kind of not just on the sideline, but some distance, I saw a little boy. He looked like he was maybe 11 or 12, although with nutritional issues, he might have been 14 or 15, I don't know. And he was watching intently, but when I'd wave at him, he would avert his eyes and he wouldn't make eye contact. This happened a couple of times, and so one time as I'm running down the field, I peeled off and kind of walked in his direction. And when I got close enough to him, I tried to strike up a conversation. His limited English, my limited Spanish, we did the best that we could, but I invited him to come join the soccer match. And I can't remember everything about the conversation. I didn't understand everything in the conversation. But as I invited him again and again and assured him, he asked me that question. Es posible para mí jugar? Is it really possible that I can play? Sure. Sí. Yes. And as we walked back toward the field, I just really subconsciously, I guess, I just reached over and I put my arm on his shoulder as we walked. And he turned and he grabbed me and he squeezed me real hard. And then he ran out onto the field and started playing soccer. And I spoke with the missionary after that. I guess he had kind of watched this scene unfold. And he said, that child doesn't have a family. He's on the streets more than he's not. And we've been trying to engage him, and we haven't had any success. And he said, your conversation and invitation to play soccer, who knows, but maybe that's the door that will open, that will change his entire life. Because see, nobody wants to be on the outside looking in. And yet most things in culture are designed to define an inside group and an outside group. And there are various hoops you have to jump through to be on the inside group. And there's also an enemy that hates everything created in the image of God. And he loves to tell us that we'll never be on the inside group. We're worthless. We're outliers. And it leads to a life of despair and depression and hurt. We've been in a series of lessons from the Gospel of Mark. Actually, we've been away from Mark for about a month. I tell you that you should read from the beginning of a chapter each week, and then, by the time we've finished a chapter in teaching, you've read that chapter 2, maybe 3 times, maybe 4 times. I had somebody approach me and go, I've been reading Mark 7 for like a month. Can you just preach that passage? So we're going to finish Mark chapter 7 today. But I've entitled this message, Great News for the Rest of Us. Because what Mark chapter 7 does is I hope you've grown in your appreciation for Mark as an author, because the way he takes out of a selection of hundreds of possible conversations and events in the life of Jesus, he takes a select few and he structures them in a way so that we're not just looking at the event, but we're looking at the overarching storyline. We're looking at the scarlet thread of redemption that runs all the way through his gospel. So let me remind you, if you can flash back weeks ago to the first half of Mark chapter 7, I want you to remember what that was about. Jesus was there with his disciples, and the scribes and the Pharisees came and began to criticize the disciples, and not so subtly criticizing Jesus in the process by saying, you guys aren't doing this right. I mean, you don't wash your hands according to the ritual ways before you eat. You don't follow all the rules that we've laid out for you. See, most religion is designed to be a system of do's and don'ts, and the design is to weed out those who are not like us. Well, that's what had happened to Judaism. The idea that God wanted to be real and personal with every human being goes all the way back to the 12th chapter of Genesis, where God calls Abraham and says, you follow me, I'm going to give you a family, your family is going to turn into a nation, and through that nation, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. But the ministry that God gave to Israel was a ministry where they were supposed to live visibly distinctive lives. They were supposed to follow a system that acknowledged the one true God. And in doing so, they were to throw open their doors and say, listen, look at the way God treats us. Look at the way God provides for us. Look at the way God makes us his people. He chooses us. Come join us. Be part of God's people. But instead, what they did was they closed their doors to the rest of the world. And then they added on regulations to what God had required, so that not only were they keeping all those people out there outside, we call them Gentiles. It's just a word that means non-Jews. But they were also building a system so that those that were supposedly inside were still being weeded out, so that what was left were the scribes and the Pharisees who could say, we live in a world where we are the only righteous ones left. You know what the scribes and the Pharisees called Gentiles? They called them dogs. You know what they called Jews that weren't serious enough about living by all the Pharisaical rules? They called them the unclean. Can you imagine how tough it must be to be so righteous that you have this burden to carry, and every day you just live in a world that is rampant with dogs and the unclean? My good God. What a horrible way to live. And yet, 2,000 years later, don't we have churches in every direction that have become very adept at closing the doors to the people they don't want in, and even to the people who make it in, setting rules and regulations so they're constantly weeding out those who are really worthwhile. What's the great news for the rest of us? It's that Jesus came and smashed that whole system right to pieces. Everybody knows that the Apostle Paul was often referred to as the apostle of the Gentiles. That is, eventually the message of the gospel goes to the non-Jewish parts of the Roman world. But you may not realize, Mark is going to show us in Mark chapter 7, after he has this encounter with the scribes and the Pharisees and basically dismantles these artificial regulations that they have thrown onto the shoulders of their people, he shows that he keeps the law of God. He keeps the way God calls us to live. But those add-ons that have religious significance to the self-righteous rulers, he trashes that system. But Mark's not going to stop there. He's going to do something extraordinary. He's going to now follow Jesus from that smashing blow against Jewish exclusivism. And he's going to go, of all places, into Gentile territory and have conversation with Gentiles. Open your Bibles to Mark chapter 7. What we're going to see here is that Mark is putting on display, as he's done several times, he puts on display the determined unbelief of the Pharisees and the scribes, but he also is pretty good, and that's why I love that Mark's information came from Peter, because Peter is being brutally honest about the disciples. He's putting their continuing dullness on display as well. And this chapter is going to be a real interesting moment, because in contrast to the disbelief of the Jewish leaders, and in contrast to the dull lack of understanding of the disciples, Mark's going to show us a couple of Gentiles that understood things that even the disciples didn't seem to be able to get. In Mark chapter 7, we finished with verse 23, so we'll start with verse 24, and we have a Gentile woman who comes to Jesus with a problem. She has a daughter who has a demon. She is being tortured by at least one demon, and she's tried everything. She has heard of this man, Jesus. She's not Jewish. She doesn't know all the background. She has no idea about messianic prophecy or anything like that. She just knows this is probably the last hope for her daughter. And she comes to Jesus. And what Jesus finds in this conversation with a Gentile woman is an unexpected confidence. This story had to be a reassurance to every Gentile who read the Gospel of Mark, that they are in fact included. And frankly, for most of us, I don't know if there's anybody in here that has a little bit of Jewish blood somewhere, but we're basically Gentiles. This is the passage that lets us see without mistake that Jesus meant to include us all along. We are not plan B. This is where he was taking us. In verse 24, it says this: "Now Jesus stood up and went away from there to the region of Tyre. And when he had entered a house, he was wanting no one to know of it, yet he could not escape notice." Now here's the thing. Mark says that Jesus left the place where he had been with the disciples and the Pharisees and the scribes, and he goes into the region of Tyre. Now Tyre is one of the main cities of the nation of Phoenicia. The Phoenicians were renowned sailors. Their country is a part of the coastal region in that part of the world. They were also extremely wealthy. They were known to produce blue and purple dyes, which were extraordinarily expensive in the ancient world because there was such a limited way to get the resources to produce it. So Phoenicia was a fairly well-off territory, but it was fully Gentile. Jesus he's been trying for some time now to get the disciples some rest. But everywhere they go to get rest, even if it's in a remote place, even if it's out in the wilderness, the people find out that Jesus is there and the crowds just flood to him. And so he finally says, okay, I'm going to get us some retreat. I'm going to get us some rest. And he takes them toward the land of Phoenicia. Now, you got to use your sanctified imagination here a little bit, because as Jesus is walking in that direction, he's got 12 good Jewish boys following behind him. They may or may not have ever crossed that border into Phoenicia before. Probably not. And as they begin to move in that direction and they get closer, you can almost hear the whispering in the back of the group. Hey, does he know where we're going? I mean, that's Gentile territory. Jesus, seemingly oblivious, just keeps marching and they keep following. They finally get to that road sign right there on the side of the road. It says, "Welcome to Phoenicia." There's no mistaking where they are now. And Jesus walks right up and continues walking. In my sanctified imagination, the 12 stop right at that border. It's almost like that scene in Lord of the Rings where Sam is walking with Frodo and he stops in the cornfield and he says, "One more step and I will be farther away from home than I've ever been." Here's 12 Jewish boys, and they're looking at Jesus, and now he's starting to put some distance because he's just walking, and they're thinking, the next step I take, I'm going to be culturally, spiritually, religiously farther away from home than I have ever been in my whole life. But eventually, Jesus is creating space. He hadn't stopped walking, and so they take a deep breath, and they step on Gentile dirt. And they run to catch up with Jesus. It says that Jesus went into a house. He wanted rest. He wanted anonymity, but it was not to be. Because even here in Gentile territory, his celebrity had preceded him. So it says in that first verse that he was wanting no one to know of it, meaning he wanted just some privacy, some time away, yet he could not escape notice. But after hearing of him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately came and fell at his feet. Now the woman was a Greek of Syro-Phoenician descent, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter, and he was saying to her, "Let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered and said to him, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "Because of this answer, go, the demon has gone out of your daughter." And going back to her home, she found the child lying on the bed, the demon having left. Now, this is not really recorded by Mark for the purposes of adding another miracle story. There is a miracle here. There is a little girl. She's tortured and taunted by a demon, and she is released in the end. Mama gets home, and she's laying on the bed, probably the first time she had seen her peaceful in a very long time. That's just stated as the facts of the backstory. The reason Mark includes this story is because of the conversation with the mother. She comes to Jesus, recognizing that Jesus is the only hope that she has. She's probably exhausted all of her other options. And she comes, and it says that she bowed down before him. Now, it says the woman was a Greek of Syro-Phoenician descent. Mark is telling us that for a couple of reasons, because I think this whole conversation takes place in Greek. Jesus often spoke Aramaic, which would have kind of been the language of the people in most of the places where he was. But here, I'm almost certain he spoke Greek, because I'm almost positive she didn't speak Aramaic. But besides speaking Greek, when Mark says she was Greek of Syro-Phoenician descent, Phoenicia and Syria were a region in that era, in that part of the world. Mark is making the point. There's no hint of Jewishness in this woman. She is as outside the boundaries of what a good Jew would accept as there could be. In fact, I wonder, even with the disciples, if they weren't just a little uncomfortable that this woman got that close to Jesus. She bows down, which shows both her respect for him and her grief for her situation. And she asks him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Now, this is where it gets interesting, and most of the times I've ever heard this passage taught, it's been taught incorrectly. So let me set you straight. All right? Jesus looks at her. She's pleading because of this problem that she can't fix. And he says, "Let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Now, a couple of things. Jesus is simply rehearsing what she may or may not have already known, which was that his mission was to the chosen people. Now, it's not because there was not going to be a day come when the Gentiles would receive the invitation to the gospel, but because initially the plan was to try and bring God's people to the place where they were ready to fulfill the promise that had been given to Abraham all the way back in Genesis chapter 12. Instead of 12 disciples, the goal was to have a nation of disciples who acknowledge and follow their Messiah. We know that's not what happened, but that was the plan. But Jesus is here, so he says this simply as the standard response to a Gentile who would ask for a spiritual blessing from a Jew. Now, what's interesting about this is it makes us a little bit uncomfortable that Jesus referred to her as a dog. Now, let me soften this understanding for you so you're not quite as bent out of shape about it. When the Jews called Gentiles dogs, they used a particular word, And that word means like a street dog. You know, the dogs that are skinny, you can see their ribs, and they'll snarl at you when you walk by. They'll snap at you and try and bite you if you pass too closely. They're the dogs that are always digging in the rubbish to try and find something to eat. That's the language. When a Pharisee looked at a Gentile and he said, that's a dog, that's the picture he had. Worthless, dangerous, unblessed. When Jesus speaks to this woman, he says, let the children be fed first, and then the dogs. But Jesus uses a different word. He uses in Greek what we call a diminutive, which is he took a word and he softened it. We can translate this word puppies. It's as if Jesus says the Jews looked at the Gentiles and they saw scraggly, scrawny, ugly, vicious, garbage-eating street dogs. But when Jesus looks at this woman, he calls her a puppy, a house pet. Now, he's softened the blow, I think, as an invitation to see what her response would be. Jesus, except for the religious leaders, Jesus hardly ever cut off conversation. He always says something that hopefully leads to the next step so that he can nurture a faith response. That's what he's doing here. So we can read this. He says, let the children be satisfied first, for it's not good to take the children's bread and give it to the puppies. Now, she could have bowed her head and walked out disappointed, recognizing that Jesus was really belonged to the Jews at this point. But that's not what she does. She answered and said to him, yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs. She seizes on his language and recognizes that he's not talking about stray dogs in the street. He's talking about beloved house pets. And she says, even the puppies, when they come and sit under the table, they get to snack on the crumbs that the children drop. Now, here's the thing. Again, use your sanctified imagination. Put yourself in that scene. Jesus is tired. He's exhausted, as are the other disciples. And they're just looking for some rest. They're worn out. And yet, in this conversation with this woman, in the most unexpected way, she sees what Jesus is saying and she understands it, and she comes back and says, but there's room, even as you feed the children, there's room for what you have to come my way. And Jesus, tired, exhausted at the end of his rope, in my mind, his eyes brighten, his smile widens, and he says, wow. He says, go home, sweet lady. Your little girl's just fine. Now, this is not in the story, but, she leaves. I don't think she's stressed. I don't think she's in anxiety. I think the Jesus that she believed in, when he said, go home, it's all taken care of, I think as she strolled home, she expected to find exactly what she found, which was her little girl just fine. But Mark doesn't tell us what happened after she leaves the room. In my mind, Jesus turns to the disciples and goes, did you see that? And in my telling of the story, he goes, be like her. She not only shows a level of faith that puts her in contrast to the scribes and the Pharisees who are determined not to believe, but she also shows an insightful acceptance of what Jesus says in a way that the disciples have not been able to pull off. They're still dullards trying to just guess what he's going to do next. Here's a remarkable instance of someone who is the least likely recipient of the attention of Jesus, and Jesus draws her into the kingdom with an irresistible confidence on her part that must have delighted him no end. He would not disappoint her pleas, and he gave her daughter back. This story tells us that we are not plan B, but that Jesus loved each one of us from the very moment that we were conceived in his mind and placed on this earth. Well, it says in verse 31, we're going to move from unexpected confidence to unsurpassed compassion. Verse 31, and again he went out from the region of Tyre, Gentile territory, and came through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee within the region of the Decapolis. Decapolis is a Greek word. Deca means 10. Polis means city. The Decapolis was simply an area that had 10 relatively good-sized villages. And so the region was called the Decapolis, 10 cities. It was on the Jewish side of the border, but it was primarily still Gentile population. So it's kind of a transitional geographical space from the purely Gentile areas to the overwhelming Jewish areas. It was kind of an in-between where you had people from both cultures there. But the chances are that the story that Mark is going to tell us follows on this conversation with the Gentile woman. So he's probably, again, talking to Gentiles and speaking in front of a mostly Gentile crowd. He came to the region of the Decapolis, verse 32, and they brought to him one who was deaf and spoke with difficulty, and they pleaded with him to lay his hand on him. And Jesus took him aside from the crowd by himself and put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, he touched his tongue, and looking up to heaven with a sigh, he said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. Now, let's talk about this. Jesus is in this area that's still predominantly Gentile, although there's a little more increase of Jewish population. And because his celebrity always preceded him, there were some friends who brought a man to Jesus that needed his help. Now, this man was deaf, but it said that he had extreme difficulty in speaking. It doesn't actually say he was mute. The Greek word there means that he had some sort of facial muscle tongue spasm problem. So he couldn't control the muscles in his face and tongue. So he could make sounds, but they were unintelligible. He knew about speech. That's how we know that he probably became deaf later in life. He wasn't born deaf. He has a conception of speech. He just has the physical inability to make speech happen. But by either disease or by an injury, at some point in his life, he became deaf, and the follow-up problem meant that he couldn't speak. His friends bring him, probably family members actually, they bring him to Jesus, and they plead with Jesus to see if he would do something for this man. And it's interesting that it says Jesus took him aside from the crowd by himself and put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, he touched his tongue, looked up to heaven with a sigh, and said, Ephphatha, be opened. All right, let's talk about that, because I've heard people give really elaborate stories about the formula or the kind of magical incantation that Jesus is doing here. Let me tell you what's happening. This is a man who, because he couldn't hear and because he couldn't speak, had probably been ignored most of his adult life, even by people in the very same room with him. I mean, disabilities sometimes make us uncomfortable and we don't know what to say, so we don't say anything and we avoid eye contact. This guy was on the receiving end of that. Jesus, every time he healed somebody, it was never about the healing. For Jesus, it was always about the person. He was always trying to connect with the soul of the person. Mark specifically tells us that they brought this man to Jesus. Jesus assesses the situation. He probably takes him by the hand and he walks him over here away from the crowds. Why? Because Jesus is not talking to the crowds. Jesus is wanting to connect with this man. And this description that Mark gives us, this is not some sort of bizarre magical formula. Let me show you what Jesus was doing. I think Jesus got this man's face and he's looking him right in the eye. Can you see me? Pay attention right here. And he reached up and he put his fingers in the man's ears. No magic. What's he doing? I'm going to fix your ears. He then spits on the ground and reaches up and captures what may have been a trembling tongue. And he holds it still. Why? The tongue is not just what we use in speech, it's also what we use to help produce and distribute saliva. If you don't have control of your tongue, one of the side effects is perpetual dribbling. He spits to show what a proper tongue looks like, and he reaches up and he holds this tongue that's trembling. I'm going to fix this. Picture the scene. He put fingers in my ear. He took my tongue. I don't understand everything that he's saying, but he's going to help me. The only response from this man must have been eyes wide open with a head nodding. Yes, yes, yes. And then it said Jesus looks up to heaven with a sigh. Looking up to heaven is language to describe the prayer that Jesus is going to offer. The sigh, this is a physical response from a compassionate man who is brokenhearted over the suffering of the man standing before him. Let me tell you something. When you have the Spirit of Christ in you, and you see a situation that is difficult, that is distressful, and you feel that heaviness, you feel that sigh, that is the Spirit of God saying you need to figure out how to be a part of the solution in this situation. With a sigh of weightiness because of this situation, he looks up into heaven. He speaks to the Father. And then, maybe in Aramaic, we really don't know what this word is, what language it's from. It doesn't show up anywhere else. Epaphta, meaning be open. He's not saying ears be open. He's not saying mouth be open. He's speaking to the man as a whole being, and he's saying, be open to receive what I'm offering to give you. You see, this was about so much more than his ears and his tongue. This was about his soul. Be open. Verse 35, and his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was removed, and he began speaking plainly. He didn't just speak better, he spoke plainly. Listen, if you could surgically fix this problem that this man had, and you could stop the tremors in his face and tongue, he would still have months or years of physical therapy in order to learn how to talk again properly. That's not what happened here. Jesus said, be open. And his life received what Jesus had for him. His ears were open so that he could hear. His mouth was fixed. He spoke plainly. This is a miracle account. But here, Mark is telling us not just about the miracle. He's talking about a miracle probably to a Gentile man, and a miracle in front of a primarily Gentile audience. Man. And he gave them orders not to tell anyone. You know, Jesus does that over and over again, and nobody ever listens to that. He gave them orders not to tell anyone, but the more he was ordering them, the more widely they continued to proclaim it. I'm telling you, this guy is now talking for the first time possibly since he was a young boy. And Jesus says, okay, don't talk about this. What? You've got to be kidding me. I mean, the minute he turns back to the crowd, they say something and he goes, yeah, I heard that, and I'm speaking to you. Well, how did that happen? He did it. Listen, why does Jesus tell people not to talk about the miracles? Because Jesus came to save our souls. He came to provide the solution to the problem of separation from God. He was not once or then or ever primarily a miracle worker. The miracles furthered what he was doing to bring the good news of the gospel. But he didn't want to be known as a miracle worker because that wasn't the primary point. So every time he'd do a miracle, he'd say, hey, don't talk about it. And every time they'd be like, can't help myself. Can't help myself. Now, unexpected confidence was what we saw with the woman. Unsurpassed compassion as Jesus treated this man like a real human being and met his needs. But then look at this. Verse 37, I want you to see unrestrained confession. And they were utterly astonished, saying, he has done all things well. He makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. A couple of things that you need to see out of this passage. And that is, the narrative concludes with this sort of corporate confession of faith. The whole crowd that was there to witness this begins to tell people about what they saw. Now, what's interesting here, remember, this is primarily, there may have been a Jew sprinkled here or there, but this is primarily a Gentile collection of people and probably a Gentile man that Jesus heals. And as they were testifying about what they had seen out of their utter astonishment, they said two things. He has done all things well. Listen, let me tell you, the devil will suggest to you over and over, it goes all the way back to the garden, can you really trust God? I mean, are you sure that if you give your life to him, that this is going to work out in your favor? Listen, the testimony of those who walked with Jesus, who were touched by Jesus, who heard and saw Jesus, the testimony was, he does everything well. And what he wants to do in your life, I promise you, he will do it well. You have nothing to lose and everything to gain by giving your broken life to Jesus and letting him make it whole. Now, they said, first of all, he does all things well. But then, look at what they said. And this is fascinating to me. They said, he makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. I think that verse, that testimony, is the reason Mark included this particular story. Here's why. The Old Testament has more than 300 prophecies specifically related to the coming of the Messiah, the one that God would send, who would eventually provide a way for us to be restored in our relationship with God, to be forgiven of our sins, to be washed clean, and to be made whole. But in those 300 plus prophecies, there's one that is in Isaiah chapter 35, verses 5 and 6. Now, what's fascinating is Isaiah lived 800 years before Jesus. So when he speaks prophecies about the coming Messiah, we know that the fulfillment of that prophecy was 800 years later. Clearly, he wasn't making stuff up. It had to be by revelation from God. But in that verse of Isaiah 35, verses 5 and 6, he says the Messiah will come and he will help the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. When this Gentile crowd, I promise you, nobody in the crowd that day had ever read the prophet Isaiah. They didn't know anything about the Jewish Messiah. They didn't know about the Jewish system of belief. They didn't know the Old Testament. They didn't know the plan of God and how he was going to bring the possibility for humans to be back in relationship and to be forgiven of their sins. They didn't know any of that. And yet, without knowing all of that, they gave testimony to what they knew, and their testimony had actually an eternal significance that they didn't even know about. He gave hearing to the deaf, and he gave speech to the mute. He helped them hear, he helped them speak. They're confirming an Old Testament prophecy that was 800 years old, and they had no idea of that. Now, why am I making such a big deal about that? Because of this. Their testimony was overflowing with eternal significance, even though they didn't know it. Your testimony overflows with eternal significance, even when you don't know it. You see, I had somebody ask me years ago in a different church. They said, I can't bring myself to give my testimony because I'm just afraid I'm going to do it wrong. Let me tell you something. The only way you do your testimony wrong is to keep it to yourself. Jesus has done something in your life. He's changed you in some way. He's made you different than you would have been otherwise. He's brought you into a community, a family that has given you a circle of those who strengthen you and make you better. There's no shortage of things. If you'll stop and think about it, if you'll take a blank piece of paper and a pen and you sit down and you just begin to say, if I hadn't met Jesus, how would my life be different right now? What has Jesus done in me and to me and around me that has changed my life? Listen, that's where your testimony starts. You don't need to summarize a systematic theology. You don't need to have the ability to explain the doctrine of the Trinity. You just need to be able to say, this is what I was, and this is what I am now, and this is what he promises that I'll be. And you talk to people about that. It is in the sharing of what we know about Jesus that something eternal takes place. Let me tell you, as a preacher, I can't tell you the number of times that I have crashed and burned in the pulpit. I mean, I preached a message and sometimes if you don't think you have much going on, you just get louder and hope they don't notice. And I've preached a lot of times where I walked to my car. Well, that was a train wreck. I didn't do justice to the text. I didn't communicate well. I mean, that was an absolute waste of everybody's time. Only for God to circle back around and show me through ensuing conversations that he used that sermon. And sometimes my worst sermons are the ones that he has the most impact for in a congregation. Why? Because it's not about me or my sermon or me and my testimony. It's about the availability to start a conversation about Jesus, and the Holy Spirit makes eternal things happen from there. Do you talk to people at work? Do you talk to people in your family? Do you talk to your neighbors? Are spiritual conversations normal for you? Or are you still subscribed to that old school of, we don't talk about politics or religion because they're too divisive? Listen, you ever read the prophets in the Old Testament? There's not one single prophet in the Old Testament. 4 major prophets, 12 minor prophets, 16 prophets, plus the ones that don't have books like Elijah and Elisha. Probably 20 legitimate named prophets throughout the Old Testament. And you know what? Not a single one of them ever has a story where somebody said, man, I love listening to that guy. I always feel so good when I leave. You're so afraid of somebody not being happy after a conversation with you. Folks, that's not your business. Stay in your lane. Your lane is to tell people what Jesus is doing in your life. You're not judging them. You're not telling them who they can and can't be. We're not here weeding out those that we allow in. We're here like Jesus with arms open wide saying, let me tell you how I got in. Why don't you come join me? We're about bringing people into the kingdom, not about defining people out of the kingdom. Jesus went to Tyre. He went to the Decapolis. He talked to a Gentile woman. He talked to a Gentile man. And what he did was he put on display that the good news is for us. And he means for us to put on display that the good news is for all the people we know as well. Your testimony is dripping with eternal significance. All you need to do is speak about what Jesus has done in your life. And that conversation becomes a platform for the Holy Spirit to do what he does. When was the last time you had a spiritual conversation about Jesus with somebody that you know? If I ask this question next week, when was the last time you had a spiritual conversation with somebody that you know about Jesus? If I ask this next week, I want every single person to be able to answer, well, it was just this week. I had a conversation. Tell them about church. Tell them about Jesus. Tell them about something that you read in the Bible that meant a lot to you. Tell them about somebody that you're praying for. Do you know there's 1,000 ways to start a spiritual conversation? Sometimes it's like, hey, man, I want to be strong at work today. I want to be focused, but I've been a little distracted because I've got somebody in my church that I love and they're in the hospital and I've just been praying for them. Just to say that provides the opportunity for somebody to go, you pray? Yeah, I pray. Because Jesus has done amazing things in my life. I mean, those conversations can start from anywhere. The only way you do your testimony wrong is to stay silent and not do it at all. Go find somebody to talk to about who you are in Jesus Christ. Listen, if you're here in this room, then you're here in this room. That's a stupid thing to say. Those of you who are here in this room, there may be one of you or more, and you've heard about Jesus, you know a little bit about Jesus, but you've never met Jesus. Maybe you feel like you're an outsider. Maybe you were pretty uncomfortable when you stepped over the threshold and came into the room today. I get that. Maybe you feel like the deaf and dumb man that, you're just kind of walking through life and you don't always really even understand what's going on around you. I get that. Let me say this to you. From the day you were born, right up to this very moment, Jesus has been anxiously waiting for the moment that he could introduce himself to you. We're going to sing in just a minute, and I know walking down to the front of a church in front of a room full of people is an intimidating kind of thing. Let me just tell you this. There's not a single person in this room that's not rooting for you with every step you take. Our pastors are going to be right here. If you don't know Jesus Christ, let us introduce you to him. There is such good stuff waiting for you. Won't you come? Sit down and have a conversation about Jesus. That's all we're asking. We'd love to set up a time where we can visit with you and answer your questions and walk you through what the Bible tells us about a relationship with Jesus and what it looks like. We'd love for you to meet our Jesus. He's done extraordinary things for us, and we know that he can do extraordinary things for you. Maybe you are a believer, but you've been lacking in the following part. I mean, you believe in Jesus and you've kind of followed him at some point in your life, but you've been distracted, you've gotten away. A lot of things have drawn you in different directions. Maybe your testimony doesn't need anything except a reboot. Maybe you need to come down here and pray with one of our pastors and just say, I'm ready to follow Jesus. I'm ready to start fresh. I'm ready to make this what it's supposed to be. I want what Jesus has for me. I want to receive that. We'll pray with you. We'd love to have that conversation with you. Man, we love prodigals who run away and then find their way home. Remember the story of the prodigal, what happened? Before he could even get this prepared speech out of his mouth, his father wrapped him up in his arms. That's what Jesus is waiting to do for you. Just come home. Just quit fighting the fight out there and come home. Maybe you're a follower of Jesus, but you don't have a church. And it's time for you to not be a Lone Ranger Christian. You need to be in a community. You need to be in a family of faith. come join us. Right now in another part of our campus is our Evergreen 101 class for this month. 30, 40, we've had 50 people a month that are coming into the family through Evergreen 101 over the last few months. We'll tell you how you can go through that process to stand with us. We believe that it's not our job to weed out the few that can be in the church of Jesus Christ. We believe it's our job to open our arms and to receive in all those that Jesus has touched and wants to come this way. Whatever's going on in your life, picture Jesus putting his fingers in your ears, grasping your spasming tongue, and whispering, I can fix this. I can make you whole. Come to me. Whatever you need, today's the day. I'm going to pray, then we're going to stand and sing, and your chance to come meet one of our pastors and talk about what God is doing in your heart right now. Father, thank you so much. What an extraordinary moment it is when we see that you are among us in this place, that your spirit is heavy in this room, and that there are people here who are hearing your word and receiving it maybe for the very first time. As your eyes look to and fro across the earth, look into this place, and we pray that what you find here are hearts that are completely yours. In these moments, move among us by your Spirit. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.